Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final seminar presentation of our 2020-2021 seminar series, virtual edition from the Bulkley Valley Research Center. My name is Dawn Hansen, and I'm the Executive Director. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm hosting today from the traditional territory of the Gidimt'en clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. We are grateful for their knowledge and their willingness to coexist with us and teach us, and our thoughts go out to all the nations as everyone grapples with the announcement this week of the finding of 215 graves of children at the Kamloops Residential School. It highlights the work that we all still have to do as we move on the journey of reconciliation, and that it's an active journey. I'd like to also acknowledge the Bulkley Valley Credit Union and the Bulkley Valley Community Foundation for their support of our seminar series. And I would also like to take a moment to thank all of you who are members and who contribute your ideas and are so willing to share your knowledge with the Research Center. That's all a key part of the success of the seminar series and the vitality of the Research Center continuing as we move into its 20th year. I'd like to welcome Susan today. Susan Miller has been part of BC Public Service for 12 years. She currently is Indigenous Relations Liaison person working with BC Timber Sales of the Smithers. She has a Bachelor of Social Work and just recently defended her master's thesis and submitted her final master's on Sunday with all the corrections. Congratulations for her master's in First Nation Studies. And her interests include wildfire, decolonization, and social change. And we're really looking forward to this presentation on wildfire community impacts on the Southside, specifically from 2018. Thanks so much, Susan.
Thank you so much, Dawn, and thanks to everyone who's joining me today. It's a pleasure to be able to share this work that I've been doing over the past few years, and yeah, just hoping that it will resonate with somebody and that we can continue this conversation. I too want to acknowledge that I'm presenting from the unceded traditional territory of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. I'm very grateful to live and enjoy this territory, live on this territory and enjoy it. I also want to acknowledge that this thesis is written about the traditional lands of the Cheslatta Carrier Nation. So I want to acknowledge their stewardship of the land and ongoing relationship with that land as well. Yeah, thanks so much for mentioning recent events, Dawn. I too am really distressed by what's going on in our national identity crisis right now. And I just only can hope that this revelation, along with the testimonies of survivors, the calls to action and the calls to justice, can propel us to a better place and force us to reckon with the truth. So thank you to everyone who's doing the work and putting in the time and looking really hard at what it means to be Canadian and at our collective history. So how my participation came about was I just want to acknowledge Sheena Briggs, who is a friend of mine, who asked me to present here. And I did have a little apprehension because my research is not scientific. And in fact, First Nation studies and a lot of the theories and work that I'm doing questions the authority of Western science as a universal truth, and also the conventional Western knowledge production system. So, you know, I really truly believe that knowledge production comes in many forms, and I think Western science is very, very important, but it's not the whole part of the conversation. So I want to bring something different to the conversation, and thanks so much for including this type of work in your seminar series. So the thesis that I wrote was born out of my passion for wildfire and my belief in the wisdom and agency of rural and Indigenous communities. It's qualitative. It does not claim authority over all experiences. It's just one part of a much larger story. And its goal is to examine a single event from multiple perspectives, moving toward a deeper understanding of that event. I believe that the more research listens to and describes the lived experiences of people, the better informed and grounded our policies and practices can be in those lived experiences. So some of my goals included decolonization, witnessing, and personal reflection and growth. I want to acknowledge all the community members and participants who informed this study, and also my wonderful thesis committee, Dr. Agnieszka Palauska-Mainville, Dr. Scott Green, and Mike Robertson, Senior Policy Advisor for Cheslatta Carrier Nation, and also my external examiner, Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen, who is a big inspiration to me and who I'm super grateful to have worked with on this. It was a real joy to work along Mike Robertson and Cheslatta Carrier Nation and the residents of the Southside throughout. All right, moving on. Oh, there we go. All right, so just in terms of locating myself and locating the place from which this thesis is written, I just want to situate my own personal location. So this whole work is written through that lens and through my own personal worldview, which I bring all my experiences to. So I was born and raised in Ottawa, Ontario, on Algonquin lands, but have been working and living in northern British Columbia for 9 years. I am an 8th generation Canadian of mixed Western European ancestry. And my first degree is in social work, but I am currently working in Indigenous relations and have held various roles through the past 3 years in that realm. I have a keen interest in learning from and about Indigenous cultures, lands, and experiences. So I come to this work with all parts of myself, but I want to highlight 2 specific places from where this thesis is written. One, I spent a lot of years working in wildfire. I worked for the BC Wildfire Service for 9 years, from 2010 to 2018. And in 2018 specifically, I was working in Vanderhoof as a wildfire assistant, mostly in operations. That season was right after another big season of 2017, which impacted communities across the province and impacted me personally in terms of my professional and personal life, I would say. And in 2018, Vanderhoof is situated east of the Southside. So a lot of the biggest fires, most active fires in the province were burning in the Southside, and the prevailing winds run east. So I was literally breathing these fires. 3 times during the summer in Vanderhoof, our streetlights went on in the middle of the day, and because it was black, it looked like the middle of the night. My car blew ash out of its, like when I turned on my vents, I blew ash until Christmas after having lived in Vanderhoof for that long through that season, and it had a tremendous personal impact on me. I chose to leave BC Wildfire Service in 2018, August, but I still carry a lot of love and connection to wildfire and research in wildfire and work in wildfire. So the second part that I want to highlight about my personal location is that I work in the BC Public Service. In 2019 and 2020, I was part of the Skeena Wildfire Rehabilitation Team. So I was working in the Southside on the land, doing consulting and collaborating with First Nations to rehabilitate the impacts from the physical impacts of wildfire. I spent a lot of time on the land and was witnessing and seeing the physical impacts of suppression practices for these fires. I came into a working relationship with Cheslatta Carrier Nation and many Southsiders. And so both of these lenses contributed to my approach to this work. And navigating work and research was definitely an exercise in transparency. I chose to disclose my dual role at every juncture, often knowing that it might impact the quality and amount of participation, given the complicated relationships that a lot of individuals and organizations have with these 2 parts that I bring to this work. So as I work to integrate all this into my research, I learned more about my own values and my beliefs that drive this work. And some of these core beliefs include that social and political change is needed, and that for this change to occur, individuals and institutions need to listen to and learn from lived experience. All right, so give a little context about what happened in 2018 in the Southside. Many of you probably live and work in Northwestern British Columbia, but it was a particularly challenging season for a lot of the folks in the Southside. This picture is taken looking across Franceville Lake, and it's just a little bit indicative of what people were living during that summer. So this is a little overview of where Cheslatta Carrier Nation territory is. You can see that it's south of Burns Lake in northwestern British Columbia. And it encompasses, like, it's known colloquially, this geographic as the Southside. It's on the south side of Franceville Lake and accessed via a ferry from Burns Lake. So it's relatively geographically isolated. You can drive around Franceville Lake, but the most common method of access is across this ferry that runs the year round. The Southside includes the communities of South Bank, Grassy Plains, Danskin, Takaisi Lake, Unsha Lake, Cattle Rose, Cheslatta, Utsa Lake, Wisteria, Marilla, and several rural settlements. And there's also two other First Nations communities located in the Southside. It's home to a mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous residents. Many people make their living as farmers, loggers, ranchers, trappers. Most, if not all, individuals have a connection to the land for their lives and for their livelihoods. So here's another map. And you can see these darker sections denote wildfire evacuation alerts and orders. And so in 2018, beginning in mid-July, several large fires burned in or adjacent to the Southside, which prompted evacuation alerts and orders. The province was in a state of emergency for 3 weeks, and emergency management organizations were strapped. There was, too much demand, not enough capacity. It was a lot was going on provincially. And so, given these evacuation orders and alerts, many Southsiders decided not to evacuate. They stayed to defend their properties and their lands. This was in direct opposition to the advice given by emergency management organizations. So, oops. Here's some of the headlines that I just pulled from some news articles. There was a lot going on. There was a lot being reported about, conflict, about, some tensions that were arising in this area. And, at this time, I was thinking a lot about, what was going on. I kind of wanted to learn more about this. So based on what I'd read, heard, and witnessed, I knew that something significant had happened in this area. I was curious to find out more. So in the spring of 2019, I chose to approach Cheslatta Carrier Nation about a research collaboration. The reason I chose to approach Cheslatta was that there's obvious impacts to their territory from the wildfires themselves, but also Cheslatta was publicly engaged in conversations about wildfire through their participation in a conference. And I think that it was the BVRC that ended up putting this conference on. Chief Karina Lewin spoke. And so I thought maybe that there would be an interest from the community in conducting some of this work in partnership with me. I contacted their senior policy advisor, Mike Robertson, and Chief Karina Lewin. And on June 13th, 2019, Mike invited me to join him as a guest of Cheslatta at a Rio Tinto water engagement workshop in Vanderhoof. So this workshop spanned the course of an 8-hour day, and we heard a lot about impacts from the flooding due to the construction of Kenny Dam. I'll get into this a little bit later. And it brought together a whole bunch of different nations, community groups, residents who have an interest in the health of the Nechako watershed. Throughout the day, Mike and I chatted. He posed me questions about my research interests, about myself, and at the end of the day, he gave me permission to include Cheslatta in my research plan. I was really grateful for this and wanted to do them proud and make sure that I centered the values and goals of the community throughout my research process and product. So with that, I delved into my research, aiming to explore the lived experience of community members. So in preparing to write this thesis, I read extensive amounts of literature. I wanted to ground myself in the context and history of the topic and to frame the project I was developing. I chose to focus on 3 different areas with the literature that I reviewed. The first area is wildfire in its historical context. So fire has been present on the land in what is now British Columbia for a long, long time. And this was present prior to colonization. Many Indigenous peoples used fire as part of traditional land management techniques. And this relationship with fire was one of intention. So though cultural burning is not the focus of my study, it is important context to understand when we start looking at wildfire suppression and the dynamics between institutions and communities. As colonial expansion continued, by extension, resource extraction and settlement into more rural areas, cultural burning was excluded and outlawed, and the proliferation and professionalization of wildfire suppression mandates followed. Now, this is not a values judgment on this. I'm just trying to paint a picture of how our relationship with fire changed. In tandem with other colonial policies, Indigenous people were systematically dispossessed from their lands and their traditional land management activities. Since then, ongoing wildfire suppression mandates have helped to create the landscape that we see today, and ultimately fed the myth that fire is controllable. As we've seen in recent years, it's not possible to suppress every fire. And I think that's becoming a growing awareness and conversation in natural resource management and in communities that are rural. The second area of focus I explored was the history of the land itself. So in terms of Cheslatta's history, my first introduction when I met Mike was at the Rio Tinto Water Engagement workshop. And so right then and there, I was immersed in this conversation about Cheslatta's history of forced relocation due to flooding. In 1952, the construction of the Kenny Dam was part of the Camano project. It was in an era of rapid wartime expansion and industrialization. Canadian and British Columbia government granted I'd have to check, granted generous water permits to Alcan, at that point Aluminum Company of Canada, and the power would run their aluminum smelter. So Cheslatta people are pushed aside, their communities were flooded, and a lot of the testimonies of Cheslatta elders talk about instances where they're forcibly relocated, little or no notice, their houses are destroyed, their chief's signature was forged on documents, just some really intense violations of their personhood and their culture. And displacement impacted people in material and spiritual ways that have lasting impacts on their lands and communities to this very day. So had to definitely immerse myself in that context to understand what's prominent and pertinent in terms of the land and the history of the land. And the last area that I explored was Indigenous experiences of wildfire. So I examined information about Indigenous experiences of wildfire along with scholarship about wildfire evacuations. There's been some really neat research and publication come out of Silcoteen and Nodli Watan after the 2017 and 18 seasons. And it's really interesting to look at these community experiences in tandem with Indigenous scholarship on these topics. So in BC, differing jurisdictions over lands, emergency management, and reserves create a lot of confusion during wildfires for who's going to issue the orders, who's going to enforce the orders, who's responsible for what services, and how things are all going to go in terms of evacuations. So with respect to First Nations, the immediate crisis of wildfires often compounded by existing housing shortages, lack of access to transportation, poverty, health concerns, among other factors specific to each community. So a nation's approach to wildfire evacuations demonstrates differing ideas about who's responsible for public safety. So the scholarship kind of points to kind of a bit of a continuum in terms of what a society sees as who is responsible. So in terms of Canada's approach to wildfire evacuations, we expect people to heed the advice given by wildfire professionals and local governments and place their trust in emergency response organizations when wildfire evacuations come in. This is in direct contrast to Australia's approach, where residents have the choice to stay and fight the fire. So again, we are more of a centralized model where people, residents are encouraged to leave during wildfire events. In terms of interpreting all this literature, I chose to read and reference works by Indigenous scholars as much as I could. So some of these people include Linda Tuai Smith, Sean Wilson, Willie Ermine, Gregory Kahete, Kathy Absalon, Margaret Kovac, and Joanne Archibald. As I was writing and reading and considering, I thought a lot about knowledge. I thought a lot about knowledge production. I thought a lot about science and the supremacy of Western science. And I asked myself, how do I come to know? How can I learn across difference? How can I honor different worldviews? If I was going to position myself as a decolonizing researcher, I wanted to center the voices and worldviews of Indigenous peoples. There we go. So I like this little Venn diagram. It kind of demonstrates a bit of a dichotomy, which, dichotomies are false, but I think it's really helpful to look at this centerpiece, this ethical space, where you can draw on the traditions of Western worldview and Indigenous worldviews and find yourself in the middle, because in the ethical space is where I wanted to live. I wanted my research to live. So I used two theories to interpret the literature and ground my work. From the Western side, the Western worldview, I used Foucault's governmentality theories. So this concept kind of connects the history of fire suppression and forest management with values and actions that are reinforced during wildfire events and their suppression. So I wanted to bring awareness to the fact that actions, policies, and procedures are not value neutral. They're reinforced and legitimized by laws and regulations, which become ways of being and ways of doing during emergency situations. I also, from the Indigenous side, made use of Sean Wilson's relationality theory. So Sean Wilson talks about relationality as a concept to examine the broader context of individuals and communities' relationships to the natural world and to one another. Relationality affirms the agency of the land itself. It affirms the agency of non-human beings as well. Because the land has a history written upon it, relationality pushes me to listen deeply and consider what story the wildfire has to tell. So methodology, I was guided by a quote by Dr. Jennifer Granz, and she says, if we want a decolonized result, we need a decolonized process. And so this was really important as I designed my methodology. I wanted to honor Indigenous research methods without appropriating them. I chose to use a qualitative case study with reciprocity and reflexivity built into it. I relied on Joanne Archibald's concept of story work and being story ready. It was an exercise in reflecting and shifting and acting. So, thinking about what a collaborative partnership means or a collaborative research relationship means, that's pretty dynamic because it all depends on where you position yourself and how you are in relationship. So I asked myself often, how can this work be of use to the community? So these ideas had to become actions. They had to become tangible as I designed my community engagement strategy. I had permission from Cheslatta's leadership to work with community members, but I wanted to build trust. I wanted to be visible in the community and spend time there. My belief driving this was that good research stems from genuine personal connection. So I was putting together my research ethics board application for UNBC and COVID-19 hit. We all know what that does to our ability to connect in person. Pretty devastating for me, on a number of fronts, but pretty impactful to my research. And it set me back and required me to rethink what kind of research was going to be possible. So recognizing that COVID-19 has most definitely impacted this study, I decided to carry on and to find ways to be creative and navigate this new complex terrain all of us were navigating. So I had some good relationships through my work with Cheslatta through wildfire rehabilitation. So I started with those. I interviewed people I knew. I asked them for suggestions during the interview of who else to connect with, which is called a chain referral technique. And building these connections through existing relationships helped me to build trust and helped me to have a real personal solicitation. So I would interview one person and then ask them to connect with the next person, and then I would contact them after. So it was a little bit strange interviewing people I had never met over the phone. A lot of people chose the phone over a video just because it was what made them comfortable. So yeah, that was a little weird. But at the same time, I did manage to make connections and build rapport because I discovered that people wanted their stories told. The demographic of my project shifted, both due to COVID-19 limitations and the different ways that my advisors in Cheslatta and Southsiders define community membership. I could not impose my definition on Cheslatta and on the Southside because I'd originally thought I was going to interview exclusively Indigenous participants. People suggested various non-Indigenous community members who had really integral and important pieces to the story, and so I followed that, and I interviewed a variety of people. I ended up with 13 participants, 5 of whom are Cheslatta staff, 1 Carrier family services staff, a diverse group of Southsiders, of which 2 are Cheslatta members and 3 are Indigenous. So in terms of my methodology, I attempted to integrate reciprocity at every step. Positivist research tries to anonymize data and anonymize participant identities. I didn't want to do that because relationality is about knowledge in its context. I wanted people who chose to be named to be able to be named, have their knowledge attributed to them. So I offered that as an option. 2 participants remained anonymous. I didn't judge or ask them to describe why. It was just totally personal choice. I implemented a fairly robust member checking process where after the interview, I would share the recording back to participants, transcribe it, share the transcription back to participants. And then if participants wanted, I would share the portion of my findings section with them that spoke about them or their story. It was a really iterative and comprehensive informed consent process that really paid homage to the concept of self-representation. Absolutely central to honoring Indigenous knowledge and honoring all knowledge. Yeah, so for the folks who were confidential, wanted to remain confidential, that was some special considerations as well, given that a lot of aspects of their stories had potential to reveal their identities. So again, lots of back and forth, lots of conversations about what can be included and what cannot. So when I was analyzing all this information, I grouped them into 6 themes, which make up my findings, which I will describe to you. All right, so my first finding was that wildfire impacted the land and the community. There was a strong link between the past and the present. People were impacted in financial, emotional, and spiritual ways. Many participants spoke about how the wildfires of 2018 drew parallels to the historical trauma of flooding and forced relocation. And that parallel wasn't only drawn by Indigenous participants. The significance of this history was there for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. It also brought about a specific dynamic with government and authority. Many people spoke about their reluctance to trust decisions and strategies because of this history and a historic mistrust. One participant talked about the impact of losing power for so long and how many families' traditional harvest was spoiled in their freezers. She spoke about how traditional foods are more than physical sustenance and that many people post-wildfire are experiencing poverty and the cost of living has gone up. So even though the fire has had a huge impact on wildlife populations, community members are being forced to make tough choices and to hunt more in order to fill their freezers. The second finding is that the landscape during a wildfire is both physical and political. So the Southside is a community with a lot of reliance on the forest economy. There's lots of logging and lots of, there's woodlots, there's various tenure holders. And Cheslatta Carrier Nation has a strong hand in this local economic driver, forestry. The fires obviously impacted forestry and forest opportunity. And many people were talking about the impacts, the financial impacts from that. In addition to people who rely on forestry, fires also impacted trappers, guides, ranchers. Participants spoke about their ideas for risk reduction. There was a lot of folks who spoke about burning as a risk reduction technique, though not everybody agreed on what should be done in the future. Many participants spoke about specific forestry practices which led to a higher volatility in the forest, specifically the amount of slash left behind from logging operations. And several participants spoke about the indelible history of fire suppression on the land and how this creates a buildup of fuel. What united people throughout was the desire to proactively address risk and to collaborate with government for positive change. So number 3, fire was a site of personal and collective struggle. So speaking to people about their visceral experiences elicited emotional responses. Both in me and in the participants, I was very surprised with how in-depth and emotional our conversations became with select participants. Many participants characterized the evacuations as a loss of control. Many people who chose to evacuate stated that they would not do it again in the future. And the stress took a toll physically on many participants. One participant suffered a heart attack post-wildfire, and he attributed it largely to the stress that he was under during that time. There had been an increase in mental health emergencies, anxiety, and depression post-wildfire. The dynamics between response organizations and the RCMP were often a source of frustration for participants. Participants described how the priorities of wildfire suppression activities were often incongruent with community values. And they also described how a lack of up-to-date and accurate information created an environment for misinformation to proliferate. So number 4, a lot of my discussions with community members focused around the infrastructure of the Southside and how it was limiting during the wildfires of 2018. So because of its geography, the Southside was closed off easily by means of ferry and road restrictions. There was an evacuation order, and so, if RCMP were, not wanting people to visit the area for obvious reasons, safety concerns. And this posed a frustration for many local people who were trying to navigate the ferry permit system. A permit system was implemented, but many participants described that the criteria for gaining access to ferry passage was inconsistent and lacked transparency. It created a lot of frustration for people who wanted to arrange for fuel, food, various other essential goods to be delivered to the Southside. The RCMP roadblocks were frustrating for many participants, and people described how sometimes these roadblocks went up without warning in areas that made no sense, and how sometimes they did hinder local people's abilities to evacuate, care for elderly neighbors and family, and evacuate their livestock as well. The Southside is an area with very little cellular connectivity. So this also was mentioned various times as something that posed a risk for people who were out fighting the fire and who were dealing with their assets and working in remote areas. There is also a conversation with 2 participants about impacts to the Three Nations water plant, which serves the Southside, and it was taxed and overused. Thankfully, the community avoided permanent damage, but it was definitely put at risk as well. So number 5, community members are a source of local and geographic knowledge. This was a common experience and a value that I heard throughout every interview. So many times the participants expressed a frustration with the ways that their knowledge, culture, and ability to respond to wildfires wasn't necessarily valued. The times when people expressed really positive interactions were times when they were given credit for their knowledge and their wisdom. People wanted to be part of the response and the solution, and they saw many inefficiencies as directly related to not consulting or including local people in strategies and practices for wildfire response. Many participants suggested integrating a local person into the incident command structure in the future. And number 6, fire was a catalyst for change. So participants were expressing hope for the future throughout interviews. And it's interesting that many of these discussions happened 1.5 to 2 years after the wildfire, and people were still talking about the healing that they're doing. You know, I got the sense that this healing is going to be like for a long time. It's not going to be an immediate process. Many individuals spoke about taking actions to address hazard near their homes and communities. They spoke about specific ways that they're going to arrange for quicker response times within the community. They talked about political changes that are happening out of necessity and an increase in collaboration between industry, Cheslatta Carrier Nation, and community groups, along with the BC government. So as part of my own research process, I gained some valuable insights and reflections, and I wanted to share these as part of this presentation. Firstly, my concept of community was totally redefined. I thought I'd be talking to Cheslatta Carrier Nation members exclusively, and through my process and my work, I was able to expand my definition of community. The ability for communities to find themselves and to be interconnected breaks apart the rigid Indigenous, non-Indigenous binary and mindset I had going into this work. And I think that's super positive. Number 2 is stories bring responsibilities with them. I was a witness to people's testimonies. Because I heard these stories, I'm compelled to do something with this knowledge. And part of the reason I wanted to share it today. Number 3, emergency situations bring interpersonal and institutional dynamics to light. In times of crisis, our relationships and our systems are tested. These dynamics existed before the emergency, and 2018 was a unique time, and it has a lot to teach us. And finally, social and institutional change requires deep listening. It's my hope that this work has contributed to this goal. It's one thread of a much larger story, and I'm super happy to be a part of it and to be allowed to tell it. And finally, thank you. Yeah, there's many angles from which to examine the events of 2018 and the impacts from that time. I bring a particular lens to this work, and one for which I've tried to be very aware of and transparent of throughout. So I just, you know, it's not a universal truth. Any of my findings are, you know, really speak to the particular time, the particular place, and my particular relationship to the topic. I want to thank all the participants, Cheslatta Carrier Nation. Thanks to the first responders who worked in the Southside, the BVRC, and to my community and family who supported me through this work. A copy of my thesis will be available through the UNBC library, and I'm gonna pass that along to the BVRC so that they can link it along with the recording of this session. With that, I think I will conclude, and hopefully we left enough time for a short discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. What a rich and nuanced presentation, and a work of research that you've done. Really phenomenal. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.